Welcome everyone to the launch of our diversity report, a challenging environment, experience of ethnic minority environmental professionals. My name's Adam Donnan and I'm the Chief Executive of the IES. This report plays a useful role in adding to the growing body of evidence about why there might be an ethnic diversity gap in the environment sector. I'm very pleased to be able to publish this report, which has been a long process from conception to publication. We started discussing the idea for this report back in 2020, and this was partially spurred on by the often quoted Policy Exchange report of 2017 that gave the shocking headline that the environment sector was the second least ethnically diverse profession in the UK. Simultaneously, we had, as an institution, been participating in the Joint Science Council and Royal Academy of Engineering Diversity and Inclusion Framework. Up to that point, we've been very focused on our own practices and monitoring the diversity of our membership, and we wanted to do something that was more externally focused. The agenda for today's launch is on the next slide. And you can see what our plans for the day is. We are going to have a quick foreword for Onwurah, followed by the report author Priyanka presenting her findings. We'll conclude with a Q&A session for you to ask us questions about the report. Please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, and you can do this at any point during the presentation or afterwards. The report would not have been possible without the support of three organisations: Bureau Veritas, Delta Simons and the Environment Agency. These three forward-looking organisations shared both our concerns in this area and the aims of the project. I want to thank them for their support and valuable guidance throughout the process. This is the first time that the IES has used this type of model to support research, and if any other organisations may be interested in participating in joint research projects, please do get in touch afterwards. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Onwurah, who has very kindly provided the foreword for the report. She is the Labour MP for Newcastle upon Tyne Central and is Shadow Minister for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. But more pertinently, for today, she is the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Diversity and Inclusion in STEM. Thanks for joining us at what must be a very busy time for you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that introduction. And you're right, this is a really busy and challenging time. I've just come from Prime Minister's questions. But let me say that this is a really important subject, which I take very, very personally as well. As you mentioned, I'm the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Diversity and Inclusion in STEM. I'm also the chair of the All-Parliamentary Group for Diversity and Inclusion in the Creative Industries. You may see a theme there. I'm the Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Innovation, but I'm also a chartered engineer and indeed a fellow of my professional institution, the Institution of Engineering Technology. And I worked for 23 years in engineering before coming into Parliament. And my sector, electrical engineering, does not win any prizes for diversity either, shall we say, and that was part of my professional experience. And that's what led me, to firstly be very pleased to accept this invitation and to celebrate the work that you are doing. Obviously, and I think as this report talks about, there are challenges which need to be overcome and cultural and other changes that need to be made. But I think it is really important that professional bodies, who represent the professionals and the culture of the profession, should be leading the way in widening participation and access within their sectors. And that is why I very much welcome the report. And because diversity matters. It's not a tick box exercise, it is an economic imperative. Without it, innovation is stifled and valuable talent that we need is excluded from the workforce. If they're not people from different backgrounds in the room taking decisions, those interests and that background in experience will not be reflected in the outcomes. And as we've heard, the lack of diversity within the environmental sector is particularly acute. The policy exchange research showed that the sector was one of the least diverse in the country, second only to farmers. And so that means that a significant proportion of our society is excluded from the sector, and with them their ideas, their perspective, their backgrounds, and we really can't afford that. The environmental sector is so important. Just on Monday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a dire warning over the mounting threat that global warming poses. We're in a decisive decade in the fight against climate breakdown, and excluding so much of, well, the UK's population, but actually also the global voice from the environmental workforce and the environmental debate is not acceptable. And so that's why this action from the Institution of Environmental Sciences is so important, particularly as it looks to build a more inclusive environmental sector through understanding the perceptions and lived experience of environmental professionals from ethnic minorities. So their insights are essential to achieving this aim. Indeed, the report found a lack of understanding of why diversity is important to the sector has led to ineffective initiatives, demonstrating how urgent the need for action is. So the report provides a number of recommendations for the sector, for employers and for individuals, based on the perspectives of ethnic minority environmental professionals, whom I applaud. And I hope the recommendations are taken up by organisations to help address the ethnic diversity gap in a representative and informed and impactful way. Last July, the APPG on diversity and inclusion in STEM sought to determine where equity and inequity exists in the workforce, and it found that barriers appear for every minorities group across the career pathway. The report also provides recommendations for the UK government and STEM organisations across the private, public and voluntary sectors to tackle historic systemic underrepresentation of minoritized groups at all levels within the sector. So I'm really pleased to be, as I said, to be involved in the IES's work and aligning, that extensive research and analysis with the work of the APPG as well, which is just one way to further our progress towards a more representative workforce. And I really want to emphasize the words that you, Adam, that you said, this is everybody's responsibility. This is in everyone's interests, and it's everyone's responsibility. There are no bystanders in the struggle for equity of representation, and particularly participation in the environmental sector. We can't allow those barriers to persist. The demographics of those who design and lead our world environmental work must reflect the experiences and needs of the whole of our society. And I know that's what this report is designed to help achieve. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chi. Thanks both for your time and that introduction, which I think gave a wonderful framing for the next section, where we're joined by Priyanka, the author of the report, to give us some additional insights into the findings. Priyanka has been ill this week, so I'm very pleased that she's able to join us, and we'll have to excuse her if she needs to pause at a few points to have a bit of a cough. So just bear with us if that occurs. Priyanka.
Hi everyone. So before I delve into the what and the how of this research was conducted, the first question that I'd like to address, which already Adam and she have touched upon, is why should we even talking about ethnic diversity within the environmental sector? Obviously, one of the most urgent triggers of this has been the 2017 Policy Exchange Report, which ranks the environmental sector as the second least diverse sector. Within their sample, they showed that only 3.1% of ethnic minorities were present in the environmental sector as compared to 20% in other sectors. Even though within the IES membership, the numbers are a bit more hopeful, the figures are a little more promising, but and comparable to UK's national workforce, we also understand that this could be skewed because of our young membership. Against this backdrop, there is an existing lack of ethnic diversity in the sector, which is why we should be talking about it. But there's also a lack of diversity data. The report by Policy Exchange was published in 2017, and it's 5 years hence, and there hasn't been more work done on it, or work that actually ascertains numbers or talks about experiences of people. So there needs to be more research. And the diversity itself presents a very important case. There's obviously sectoral importance. The diversity conversation is very important, and to improve ethnic diversity, it is critical to understand the opportunities and challenges that exist at the moment. Additionally, there's also a growing body of literature that suggests factors such as lack of access to green spaces, negative environmental impacts, and minimal environmental education opportunities correlate with race, culture, and ethnicity. It is likely that the communities that are actually most impacted by environmental changes and environmental factors are actually not a part of the conversation about how to resolve such issues, have no role to play in research solution and policy design as it stands. And from a moral and epistemic point of view, diversity is important for social justice. By giving voice to people from ethnic minorities whose experience up until now have been overheard, misunderstood, or neglected, what we're trying to do is correct an epistemic injustice. Diversity, ethnic as well as of other kinds, is important as it impacts workplace welfare directly. When you have a more diverse workforce, a McKinsey study in 2016 showed that not only were revenues better with diverse workforces, but people also felt better within such teams. Given this, we sought out to conduct our research with 3 specific aims. One was to map ethnic diversity within the sector to see what numbers looked like in the 2020s, 2021, 2022, had the numbers changed from Policy Exchange report? Was the sample now different? But we also, more importantly, wanted to understand the lived experience of ethnic minority professionals. What were their perceptions? What were their experiences? What did their everyday life look like? Was it something that was evident to them or not? And to also explore alongside it organizational viewpoints and initiatives. So the reason we did this, that we looked at ethnic minority professionals' experiences as well as an organizational viewpoint, was to understand where was the dissonance. Were the experiences entirely different to what organizations thought, or were organizations not able to understand what these experiences were, which is why there was a gap in promoting diversity within the sector. To this end, we decided we needed to do a mixed methodology study. So we used quantitative methods as well as qualitative methods. Very briefly, as part of quantitative methods, we conducted an organizational survey that was sent out to organizations to understand what numbers for ethnic diversity looked within such organizations at seniority level in different kinds of roles. This was actually filled by 27 organizations. We also, at the end of our research process, conducted an individual survey, which was open to people from all ethnicities, so ethnic minorities as well as majorities, to understand whether there was a difference within experiences that people from ethnic minorities were having as compared to the view that the ethnic majority had. This was filled by 251 professionals. For qualitative methods, we actually interviewed 12 individuals from ethnic minorities who'd been working in the sector. We conducted 4 interviews with EDI professionals in the environment sector. So these were people who were officially conducting roles within the equality, diversity, and inclusion space. They had job titles that included ED&I. And we conducted interviews with 6 heads of organization to understand the organizational top view. Very quickly, I'll take you through the sample. For an organizational survey, which 27 organizations ended up filling, only 18 collected diversity data, 9 had no data that they collected about diversity. Out of these 18, 13 of those organizations did not share the data with us, and only 5 organizations shared data. And that sample was, in the end, not large enough for us to draw conclusions about what numbers looked like at the moment. But I think importantly, what this organizational survey has told us, that either organizations are really ashamed or embarrassed to share such data with us, or they're not actually collecting data, or it's not something that's on top of their list to be able to discuss. But I have to say this could also be because of GDPR regulations, though it was an anonymous survey, but organizations could still be skeptic. For the individual survey that we conducted, which was filled by 251 professionals, 82% were ethnic majority. When I say ethnic majority, I refer to the white ethnicity group. For ethnic minorities, we're talking about mixed ethnicity groups, Asians, Asian British, Black people, and other ethnicities. So we're looking at those 4 groups when we look at ethnic minorities. For the individual survey, 82% were ethnic majority and 18% were ethnic minorities. As far as gender was concerned within the individual survey, it was more or less balanced across ethnicities. For our interviews with ethnic minority professionals, we conducted 4 interviews with mixed ethnic groups, 5 with Asian ethnic groups, and 3 with Black ethnic groups. Out of this, in each category, we only had 1 male member from the ethnic group and the others were female. We did try to reach out to men specifically to speak about their experience, but we couldn't get so many men interested in the topic. That could just be because it doesn't necessarily affect them as much because of intersectionality, which I'd be talking about later. It could just be that they're not as open to talking as women might be. For work experiences, we looked at an entire range. So there were people who had just recently joined the sector 6 months ago. There were people who'd been working in the sector for more than 20 years. So there's a whole range of people and their engagement with the environmental sector that we looked at. For interviews with the heads of organizations, we spoke to 6 individuals, 4 women, 2 men. Out of the 4 women, there was 1 who was from an ethnic minority. Otherwise, everyone else was white. For interviews with ED&I professionals, we spoke to 4 individuals, 1 man and 3 women. And out of the 3 women, only 1 was ethnic minority. So on the screen, you can see right now a lot of keywords that we've put up. These were basically the kind of things that we found out through our individual surveys, as well as our interviews, the kind of things that people were talking about. So a lot of professionals mentioned not having a voice. A lot of ethnic minority professionals spoke about how in meetings they were spoken over, or people would directly, if they had said something, ask the white person in the room to say the same thing as well in order to confirm. A lot of times this would be within teams. A lot of times it would be externally. People mention being left out of email chains and not having an idea what to do about it. So what I found very strange was that in this particular interview, there was this person who was telling me about how they had been constantly being left out of chains, email chains for opportunities for career growth. And when they brought it up, people said, oh, we'll put you in next time, but it never happened. And then they were at a loss of what they could do about it. And when I said, oh, but have you tried speaking to HR, or to a manager, or to someone else about it? And that thought of actually talking to someone else about it had not even crossed their mind, because that's how normalized everyday kind of implicit bias or racism is, that it doesn't even strike you as something different that you need to act against necessarily. There was an argument of merit that was very prominent in the individual survey that was thrown out, which obviously, as you know, was filled mostly by white ethnicity. And this argument of merit stems from the fact that why should we even care about how people look like or where they come from? We only want the people who are most deserving. And I think the flaw in the argument here is that the definition of merit itself, who defines merit? What are the measures to actually understand merit themselves? And there's a long-standing research that talks about how merit itself is biased, because it actually predispositions certain communities to perform better than other communities, because the definitions are biased. People spoke about not feeling a sense of belongingness, not feeling like they had any role models. A lot of people in the interview spoke about actually not having anybody else within their organizations who looked like them, especially if they were smaller organizations, and not having a role model as easily. Sorry. Yeah, so overall findings from the study, we found out that through our individual survey, through our organizational survey, through everything that we did, there was a general consensus about the sorry state of affairs, that the ethnic diversity within the sector was non-existent. Most people mentioned that the only time they realized that the lack of diversity had been normalized so much that the only time they realized that, oh, there needed to be diversity could be when they'd see actually a person who looked different. That every morning, mostly for most people, they'd look at all white screens, all white or all male screens. So, but people also admitted that there were a lot of initiatives that were undertaken in the last 2 years, that they could see the conversation getting a bit louder, but that was in the aftermath of George Floyd case, that Black Lives Matter, when it gained momentum, as we all know. I think what it did was it put a lot of pressure on organizations to actually change the image that they'd created for themselves, or organizations basically couldn't afford to look a certain way anymore. So there was a lot of murmur about it, but a lot of ethnic minority individuals felt that this was limited to emails, one-off emails about organizations caring about equality, diversity, and inclusion, but not so much in terms of change or in terms of programs being launched. I think because a trigger was the George Floyd murder case, the focus was almost immediately on perceptions and on looking a certain way that you could not afford to look so white or so male. But this is yet to be matched by translation of these objectives into experiences. So there's a term called adverse inclusion, which says that it is not necessary that people aren't included within organizations, but when they are included, they're included on adverse terms. So it could be, for example, that you do have people from other ethnicities within an organization, but the terms of, say, career growth or advancement of opportunities or access to training and skill is different for them. Ethnic minorities faced a range of issues from stereotyping, which included a person of Indian origin being told that they were expected to work harder than everybody else just because they were Indian, and this leading to somebody actually letting their health go or not putting themselves first and letting it affect their health so much because it was a stereotype that had been ingrained so much organizationally as well. It ranges to overt discrimination at client sites where either sexist or racist jokes are made, or people are told that, oh, but people don't actually look like you here. Or in meetings, clients tend to ask specifically for people who look a certain way. For career progression, a lot of ethnic minority professionals have reported moving jobs because they were being passed over for promotion again and again. And when they would bring it up, because the structures were so ambiguous for promotion, or the parameters were so ambiguous for promotion, that they would actually not be told why they weren't being promoted, because it seemed like the goalpost kept moving whenever they were closer to achieving it. As I've already spoken about, the issue of voice was very prominent in terms of feeling like they didn't have a voice, or if they had a voice, their voice wasn't listened to as much. A lot of people also spoke about them struggling with this feeling of being the token non-white person within groups, that you were just a part of a diversity exercise, but not actually someone who was wanted in the group. Organizational issues specifically range from being cultural, referring to the organization culture, or structural in terms of recruitment practices, in terms of promotion opportunities, and not having specific set parameters for, say, career growth or promotion opportunities, and not having transparency in structures, basically. The other issues that a lot of organizational heads specifically spoke about were sectoral issues in the environment sector, which basically relate to the history of the sector. So I was told in an interview that the sector started off as a very white middle-class profession, because it was those people who cared about land issues at certain points of time, and that kind of translated. And the sector is still struggling to dissociate from that image, and that history has kind of created a block. For geography, a lot of organizations mentioned that because a lot of work in the environmental sector is done in rural places, and rural places are not known to be as diverse, that is why they were struggling to attract talent that was more diverse, because they were looking at a pool of, say, people who weren't ethnically diverse as it is. And obviously, as we've already discussed, the image of the sector, specifically as being white, but also the sector of not actually providing stable career opportunities to people. So a lot of time, what people in ethnic minorities said was they weren't aware of employment opportunities within the sector, or their parents still didn't understand what they did, because it wasn't as straightforward as being a doctor or as being an engineer or as being a lawyer. So I think that image of the sector to provide stable opportunities did not exist for people to want to aspire to be in the sector. As I've already spoken, there was also, we could note from our study, there was an existence of intersectionality. So a woman from an ethnic minority is doubly disadvantaged because she's struggling with her gender vulnerabilities as well as her ethnic vulnerabilities. It was very interesting because somebody in an interview actually mentioned to me that if it was something about sexism, they might know who to talk to within an organization or who to approach to or how to handle that. But actually, if it was about racism, they might not know how to do it. So structures to actually address such issues did not exist within organizations, or if they did, people weren't aware of who they should go to raise these things. Meritocracy, as I've already discussed, was used as a counter argument. And I think what she and Adam have both touched upon was something that I found out was very crucial as well to the success of diversity initiatives. The need to look at diversity as someone else's job within the sector. Or there's the HR person who look at it. Oh, there's this person who's been assigned to look at it, and not as collective responsibility of everyone within, or of diversity as a business case simply. Is the reason that there's not as much backing as there should be. There is a lot of lip service, if I may be so harsh to say that. There is a lot of talk about it, but the talk is not necessarily matched by action. And a solution to that long-term could be to rethink diversity as a business case. Though ED&I roles were created in most organizations, these EDI roles were not very thoughtfully or meaningfully created. They weren't necessarily backed by financial resources or human resources. If they were, then there weren't adequate training. In most cases, there was just somebody who was taken off from a particular job that they were doing and put in an EDI role without necessarily having ED&I training. And ED&I training or education or formal education is also something that needs to be inculcated. It's something that's very important because not everybody can deal with ED&I issues, no matter how much you're passionate about it or how much you've read about it or how much you care about making a difference. There's a lot more that needs to be done. So equipping EDI professionals to actually have access to such training or being more collaborative in terms of knowledge sharing is a great way forward to actually make sure these EDI roles are actually thoughtfully and meaningfully carried out. Based on our overall recommendations, we also came up with, based on our overall findings, we also came up with a few recommendations, and we've divided the recommendations at 3 different levels because we realize that it is collective responsibility as well as individual and organizational responsibility. So recommendations need to address all 3 levels. For the sector, I think I was talking to someone and they told me that, when they'd go on hikes, they would be the only non-white person, and then they would be looked at a certain way and made to feel conscious, because I think the engagement of a lot of ethnic minorities with the natural environment doesn't exist as much. So I think support programs that cater especially to increasing such engagement would come in handy so that from a younger age, people engage with the natural environment in a different way. I also know that a lot of times access to public parks is different for people from ethnic minorities as well. The other thing that can be done is increasing the visibility of employment opportunities within the sector. So if the sector itself is seen as providing stable, secure jobs, a lot of the image would change as well, and a lot more ethnic minority professionals who necessarily cannot afford to take a job that's not as secure would be able to join because there'd be more awareness created around that. Obviously, this awareness also can be created through investing in specific scholarships, bursaries, and internships that are specifically aimed at ethnic minorities. Organizations as a whole, the sector as a whole, needs to ensure that engagement with materials and activities and events is diverse and inclusive, but again, walk the tightrope between it being inclusive and diverse, but not just for the sake of it. So not doing tokenistic inclusion is very, very important and something that needs to be understood. As I've already discussed, there's an impact that intersectionality has, and obviously we haven't done it as part of this study, but it needs to be explored, that how does gender, how does social mobility, for example, interact with ethnic diversity to actually create particularistic experiences for certain kinds of people. As far as employers are concerned, I think an overhaul of recruitment policies and practices would be a good starting point, and that means not only looking at having diverse shortlists, but also looking at what parameters are we judging people on, how are we defining merit, how are we looking at resumes, are we looking at the context, so basically contextual background information that needs to be evaluated alongside just looking at someone's achievements. Also, ethnic minority candidates should have access to internal trainings and opportunities so that they can enhance their skills that they might not have had an opportunity to do so in the past. And if career growth promotion is more defined, structures are more transparent, parameters are better set, it would lead to improved conditions for people from ethnic minorities, as it would reduce human bias. Obviously, ED&I roles should be designed thoughtfully and should be backed by human and financial resources, conducted by people who are trained to handle these kinds of issues. The other thing about training that I found was very interesting was that a lot of times people would tend to say, but we do have ED&I training, we do have unconscious bias training, we do have this kind of training or that kind of training. But EDI is not an issue that you can deal with and check that off. It's something that needs to be continuous and dynamic, especially in an ever-changing world around us. We need to make sure that our training is dynamic and continuous and includes all levels of management, all kinds of people across the board, because it's not just a particular group of people who need to be trained. It's everyone who needs to be trained to be better and to promote better organizational culture. Also, ED&I initiatives will not succeed if they do not include people who they are targeted to in the design and evaluation of such programs. It is important that you have buy-in from ethnic minorities when you're designing these programs, because they are the ones who know what they go through and they're the ones who can actually evaluate. And on the point of evaluation, it's important that ED&I initiatives are not just started, but also monitored regularly based on collectively determined metrics. And last but not the least, change cannot happen if we as individuals do not do our bit. I know that none of us want to hear that we're sexist or racist or any of that, and most of us would never believe that we are. But the thing is, in such a changing socio-political milieu, it's on us to constantly unlearn and relearn and educate ourselves and introspect, because a lot of times our social conditioning is such that we don't even see these things, and these are so normalized within our psyche. So the act of questioning yourself every time is very, very important and is a good practice in the sector. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Priyanka. And hopefully that has inspired participants to go away and read the report if you haven't already. The report is available to download from our website, which is the-ies.org, where it's linked in both on the homepage and from the reports page. I would urge you not to skip the appendix, which is usually the most uninteresting part of the report, but this report has some really incredible, interesting qualitative data that we quote quite extensively in the appendix. And for me, when I was reading the report for the first time, I found some of that to be the most interesting and at times quite moving to hear about individual experiences. This report for us is not the end of a journey, it's very much a beginning. And as Chi mentioned, professional bodies should be taking a leadership role in this area. So we as an institution need to go away and digest the results and work out what we're going to do next. But I think also it should be a reflective process for other organisations in the sector. I think we need to recognise that systems change is really hard and that underrepresentation is a wicked problem, and interventions may not always have the desired outcomes. And it's very important that we as organisations have a learning philosophy and that we actually collect evidence of what works and what doesn't, but also recognise that something that may work within one context may not work in another. There are lots of initiatives being undertaken in the sector, as Priyanka mentioned, and there's been a blossoming of these over the last couple of years. And glancing down the participant list today, I'm pleased to see that a number of the individuals working for those various initiatives are here today, because systemic change cannot be achieved by one organisation alone. I love Chi's line that there are no bystanders within this struggle. So we want this report to be a start of a conversation that people take away and should result in action. I'll be chairing this next section to sit alongside Priyanka to answer questions that fall outside the report. But Priyanka is here to answer any specific questions that you might have about the research and conclusion. I see a couple of questions have already come in. If you could keep those to the Q&A box, it makes it easier for me to manage. And we'll work through those. So Priyanka, somebody asked if there's also an issue with recruitment into organisations, or is it mainly with the progression and retention of minorities? And I know there was a big section on this within the report?
I think the best way to answer is to say there's an issue that exists at every stage right now, that obviously organizations are not attracted enough diverse candidates, but even the candidates that they are attracting are necessarily not clearing, say, recruitment processes. And if they are, they're not actually feeling like they belong. So they're not, or they don't have opportunities to grow. So I think the issue lies with all sides of the journey at this point of time. So like ethnic minority candidates aren't being retained, but they're not being recruited either. So I think the change will only happen when we focus on external as well as internal factors. And external factors are about actually attracting ethnic minority candidates, and internal factors are actually about retaining them by making sure that the organization itself comes across as an inclusive one to people who work within the organization. If that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. Next question is about how the environment sector may be changing. Do you think the job opportunities in tackling climate change, which impacts upon everyone, will make the environment sector more attractive to a more diverse group of people?
So when I spoke to a lot of people from ethnic minorities who were actually working in the sector, the reason why they were working in the sector was obviously because they were passionate about the environment. They realized what climate change was doing. So obviously that's a great selling point to get people interested within the sector itself. But that selling point can only be used if people know that there are employment opportunities. So the issue is there and everyone understands there's an urgent need to, but how to address that issue is by actually being involved in the sector. But the sector has involvement opportunities. So I think it needs to be communicated that there are employment opportunities. And if that happens, people will obviously buy in because they're passionate about changing the environment, about climate change and the environment.
I guess my reflections on that point would be, in the 15 years that I've worked in the environment sector, I've seen a real evolution in the motivations of people to work in the sector. And 15 years ago, it tended to be that people were kind of what you would call deep greens, very passionate about the environment, often had a very personal story about a strong personal connection with nature. And I guess as the sector grows and really frames itself as kind of one of the grand challenges and exciting challenges of society, and as capital kind of rushes into the sector, the diversity of the jobs within the sector grows considerably, and therefore the diversity of some of the candidates might grow. Next question is about, do you have any recommendations for gaining engagement from ethnic minorities and ensuring their confidence in any ED&I approaches? I guess when I was reading the report, that did come through quite clearly, that sometimes there was a gap between what companies felt was going to be achieved by their ED&I policies and what was actually felt by people on the ground.
I think recommendations for gaining engagement from ethnic minorities is, I think ethnic minorities are, and I'm assuming that this person means that this is for an organization for themselves. So that's how I'm reading it. That is it. How do we gain engagement from within the organization from ethnic minorities, right? Am I understanding the question correct? I'm not sure if they're talking about getting it from communities or getting it from professionals within the organizations.
I would read it as engagement from staff around. Yeah.
So I think ethnic minorities need to see that there's an intent, and that intent needs to be shown. So most people that I spoke to were very interested to be involved, but also one thing that this does is it places undue burden on people who are from ethnic minorities, that they have to take up all diversity issues themselves. So there needs to be a balance struck between how much we expect them to be involved in diversity issues, as well as they're there to do a job and to actually do well in their careers. So if there's support enough where they realize there's cushioning for their careers in that sense, that is also as important, and they can do both consecutively, simultaneously, I think that would lead to more buy-in from people. And I think it's middle management as well as top management that needs to communicate its intent to actually meaningfully change, and not to just change perceptions, but actually people's experiences. And if that is there, people would be more willing. And if you tell them that they're going to be a part of the design, the effective execution, as well as the evaluation of policies, they would see that their voice matters. And I think if that is communicated well, they'll have confidence in EDI approaches more. And I think to get that buy-in also, so if I look at a panel and I realize, oh, they're doing something, but it's not a very diverse panel itself, I might not be so keen in like seeing what they can actually do, as against if I thought that the panel itself was diverse, for example.
Thank you. And a question I think that ties in quite strongly with that is, do you think organizations need a much more explicit conversation about systemic racism and how that plays out at organizational level and possible ways in tackling it?
I think that's a very, very important question. And one of the first things in the report, if you read through this, is that there's not enough empathy. So empathy around issues of racism, empathy around diversity, for example. And until we have very explicit conversations about why diversity is important, why is diversity not why should diversity not be juxtaposed with merit, for example, until we have these very hard-hitting conversations, which are not the nicest conversations to hear, I don't think change will come. If we can't openly talk about something, will we actually be able to change it? No, we'll only be ashamed of it and keep brushing it under the carpet. As long as organizations are ashamed of what they're doing and not they'll keep thinking about how to change perceptions, but not actually change. They need to know that these conversations need to be had in the open. People need to have open avenues to voice. And it shouldn't necessarily affect, for example, their perceptions within. A lot of people from, say, brown and black ethnicities were worried in the study that if they kept bringing up issues about racism, they'd be look at that brown person or that black person who always has an issue with everything. So I think unless there's a safe space that's created for everyone to openly share how they feel, so these things won't be tackled at all. So yes, it is very, very important.
There's a couple of questions coming through that I'll join together, and it's really about how do you get buy-in from senior management or commitment from a board around this? And I guess there's two perspectives on this. One is from the perspective of the staff member, but I've also, in conversations with CEOs and senior management, often detected a slight fear of misstepping when they come into this area, that they might not be fully versed in all of the linguistics around it, and almost a kind of a fear from their perspective to get engaged with it. And I guess part of what we wanted from the report is that there's some recommendations at the end that organizations can go take away and start thinking about this. But do you have any additional thoughts, Priyanka?
I think when we spoke about training, that should be dynamic and continuous, and training extending to all kinds of people. So we also mean all seniority levels. So even senior management need to be trained, because this ED&I issues are in themselves very specialist in a way that there is a certain terminology, there's a certain linguistic grammar, for example. So to tap into that, I think senior management also needs to be educated. It can't be expected that senior management already knows everything and they're going to dictate everything. I think it needs to be more collaborative in the sense that they should be willing to learn as well. And I think that kind of buy-in, when you realize that it starts at an individual level with empathy and unlearning and relearning, will translate onto other levels as well. So we need to keep in mind that if we're empathetic, if someone actually does something, for example, a lot of people are wary of saying things because they're just scared of being called out. I think if it has to be a safe space, it has to be a safe space for everyone, not only people from ethnic minorities, but also for ethnic majorities to come up and say their perception without fearing that they'd be judged just because they're asking something that other people think of as basic, for example. So I think that creation of safe space goes always, and training for everybody. Like, I think those two are, for me, most important to get that senior management buy-in, except for diversity being a business case, of course.
Yeah, I think that's very strong points. It goes both ways. And I think all parties need to recognize that this is happening in the real world and not just on Twitter.
Yes.
Okay, turning our attention to education. I know this wasn't a thorough investigation of the education area. This was more looking at professionals and their perceptions. But do you think there there is anything that can be done to encourage ethnic minority students to pursue environmental subjects in HE. Are statistics available for this is the second part of that question, which I can come back to in a second. Priyanka.
So I think for the first part of the question, I think we do suggest that there should be investment in scholarships, bursaries, and internships. So if there's specific scholarships that are catered to specific kinds of communities, those communities would get to know about them more. And then you'd have them buying into like educational opportunities. For example, if at school level you have some scholarships, some apprenticeship programs, some short-term internships for a week for high school students who are from, say, a certain ethnic minority, then when they might be more likely to take up these courses at college level or at postgraduate level, because they would have done it and they would have seen what a career in the sector actually entails. So I think that communication at that level needs to be incentivizing students in a way.
And just from our perspective as an institution, our education arm is called Chairs, and we have a method of having some influence over universities through our accreditation scheme. And for about 2 years now, we've been collecting ED&I information about the types of initiatives that universities are undertaking, and that's split between the institutional level and the program level. We're very soon going to be starting to put together some best practice guidance for those universities that eventually will become part of our accreditation standards. So there is some work being done there. There's also another organisation that I think are probably in attendance today called Equator, who are looking at that right across the whole GEIS subjects, that's geography, sciences and environmental sciences. Okay, and in terms of statistics, those statistics are available, and I believe they have been requested by a number of organisations. So we should be able to pick up some longitudinal data around engagement at HE. So in terms of kind of practical steps that leadership, people in leadership roles can take, I know we kind of covered this with an earlier question, but you know, beyond kind of engaging with it and learning, what would you advise, like a senior leader, to kind of start on this journey?
I think it'll be different for all kinds of organizations, but I think listen to ethnic minorities themselves, listen to the vulnerable groups with protected characteristics that you're trying to encourage, and listen to the specific issues that they have within your own organization and respond to those. So instead of just looking at blanket things that are being done by everyone else, within every organization, solution needs to be customized. So you have to understand that and be willing to put in the time and the effort, the financial resources and the human resources to actually create environments within organizations that are secure and stable for people from all kinds of backgrounds. And I think when there is that openness to listen and openness to learn in terms of what candidates from diverse backgrounds actually need within an organization, and respond to that effectively and quickly, instead of just saying the right thing, always doing the right thing. I think realizing that it's time for action, and research also, for that matter of fact, needs to be actionable at this point of time.
And a comment just come through on that previous HE question, just a piece of information for attendees that I think Rachel Drayson from IEMA, that they have requested data from the Higher Education Statistic Agency for feeder subjects into higher education for environmental careers in terms of ethnic diversity, and that will be published shortly. Sorry, Rachel's from SOS UK. I should also mention a number of other initiatives that are going on in the sector, which people might want to join in with. One is Race for Nature. I know that that's heavily tied into the Kickstarter scheme, so I'm not sure how long more it'll be going for, but we've had a placement for them, and they're looking to use internships as a way to increase diversity in the sector. Voyage Youth as well are an organisation worth exploring. There's the Diverse Sustainability Initiative, which quite a lot of professional environmental organisations are part of. And do look at SOS UK, and in particular their new race report, which is very specifically focused on charities and representation of people of colour within those organisations. Also worth looking at the Wildlife and Countryside Links peer support network for people of colour. And I know that the Research Council is also getting involved, and NERC has its Hidden Histories project. Good. I think that brings us to the end of the questions that we've got, which just leaves me a little time to make some thanks. I would first of all like to thank Priyanka for presenting today and for what is an excellent piece of research. I'd like to thank all of the research participants who took the time to be very candid and honest with us, and I hope the results are useful for you. I'd also like to thank other IES staff members who were involved, particularly Rihanna Jarvis, Dan Ward, Claire Roth, Daniel Kopecki, and Catherine Carr for their help in putting together the report and today's event. And I'd also like to reiterate my thanks to the three supporting organisations. We'd like to continue this debate, so please do get in touch with us after you've read the report, and if it brings up any particular issues that you want to talk about further. Watch this screen. We'll be coming up with more stuff in this area when we've had a chance to reflect on the report. Our next webinar is on a very different subject. It's on Wales. Can they help us turn the tide on the climate crisis? And that will be held on the 16th of March. So I hope to see some of you there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.